There are an estimated 380,000 churches in the United States alone. They are common gathering spots for people to share their faith. If you're in trouble and need a safe haven, oftentimes a church would be considered a good option. Even people who aren't regularly churchgoers may enter a church for an event such as a wedding or a funeral, always expecting to leave at the end of the service. Sometimes, though, the church itself doesn't want to let us go. Edmund Crefeld was born in Germany, but it isn't known exactly when. People have narrowed down the time frame to being in the early 1870s. He arrived in Portland, Oregon at the end of the 19th century. In 1899, Edmund joined the Salvation Army in their efforts to convert people to Christianity. He was posted at locations in Oregon City, McMinnville, and Heppner, but everywhere he worked, donations would suddenly decrease. In 1901, Edmund claimed that the Holy Ghost had instructed him to stop soliciting for money and to leave the Salvation Army. Instead, he joined a man named Martin L. Ryan, who operated a Pentecostal church in Salem, about 40 miles south of Portland. To Martin, too many churches allowed sinful activities such as smoking, drinking, dancing, and playing cards. While working with Martin, Edmund proclaimed himself to be God's elect and that he was communicating directly with God. In 1903, he moved to the small town of Corvallis, another 40 miles south of Portland. Edmund believed that Corvallis was Eden because it was at the end of the Oregon Trail. It was the paradise at the end of a long journey for so many people. There he started his own church, which would eventually be called the Brides of Christ. Edmund started off preaching the beauty of the full gospel. He preached, "If ever we expect to gain heaven and see the King in his beauty, we must live holy lives here on earth. The Word of God tells us to follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. In the Bible, God speaks to men, and we must search the Scriptures to know the will of God concerning us. And after we have found out His will, the next thing is to do it." His preaching was nothing outrageous, and he began gaining followers. Once he gained confidence, he began speaking negatively about other churches. They were not delivering the Word of God properly, not like Edmund was. This was of course because he was also in direct communication with God. When his followers asked him for proof, he was honest with them. He explained that he couldn't prove it. He stated, "It cannot be explained or described, only experienced." He went on to tell them that anyone could communicate directly with God as long as they become worthy. Once they received their own message from God, their name would be inscribed on a holy roll in heaven. He told them that they needed to act fast though, as there was limited space on the holy roll. If you don't have your name on the roll, you would be damned to hell for eternity. This was the turning point in Edmund's attempts to amass a loyal following. Some of the people attending the sermon got up and left, but not everyone. Some people stayed, believing that Edmund was in fact God's elect. That night, the group spent 12 hours begging God for forgiveness for their sins. Edmund told them that they needed to roll on the floor until they had atoned for their sins. This is how the group became known by locals as the Holy Rollers. People were rolling around, banging their hands on the floor, praying at the top of their lungs. By the end of the event, all that were left in attendance believed that they had received a personal message from God. Edmund told them that they were all now God's anointed. Edmund's marathon sermons began drawing complaints from people who lived nearby. They were tired of hearing people hooting and hollering for hours on end, yelling to God, stomping their feet, and clapping their hands. The residents complained to the city of Corvallis, who, in the summer of 1903, ended up banning Edmund from holding sermons within the city limits. Edmund took this opportunity to inform his flock that God had told him to hold a camp on Kiger Island, just south of Corvallis. He told his congregation to bring their family and friends because they should really get their names on that holy roll sooner than later. Edmund's invitation brought many people out to the island that summer. Many had left the Methodist Church to join the Salvation Army, and then left the Salvation Army for Edmund's church. Once they gathered on the island, Edmund announced that he was now Joshua, the holy prophet. He explained that the seals mentioned in Revelations would very soon be broken, and curses and plagues would visit the earth. The world would be destroyed by fire, and a new world would be born where nothing but peace would reign. There would be no sin. It would be the same as when God created the world in the beginning. Joshua, said that at that time he would become Elijah, the restorer. It would be his job to lead the 12 tribes of Israel back to Jerusalem, where the restoration of all things will take place and the millennium would dawn on earth. At the camp, Edmund held marathon sermons averaging 24 hours. His followers would literally spend an entire day rolling on the ground, begging God to forgive their sins. Edmund was able to slowly build up his control of his followers. He brought the crazy proclamations out gradually, building up trust and loyalty with his congregation. His control didn't always work, though. One of his followers, Maud Hurt, was engaged to local businessman James Barry. He had money and Edmund wanted it. He had already borrowed some in order to start his church and had yet to pay it back. Edmund made the proclamation that God wanted James to quit his job, sell all of his possessions, and give the money to Edmund. James refused and told Edmund that he was past due to pay back his loan. Edmund said that the debt had been canceled by God and instructed him to write a receipt saying the loan had been paid in full. James wouldn't do that either. Edmund informed James that God was now mad and had ordered Maud to call off the engagement, which she did. Having Maud obey his order to call off her engagement to James gave Edmund an idea. He proclaimed that the relationship of man and wife was unholy. He ordered 2 other women to call off their engagements, and they did. Then he told his flock that he needed to perform a ceremony that would endow them with grace and love. Each woman would individually go into Edmund's tent for the evening, and they would spend the night praying. At the end of the ceremony, Edmund would tell the woman to put her arms around his neck and kiss him. If she refused, she would be denounced, and Edmund would declare that she was carnal and of the devil. That wasn't just a title that put shame on a church member. Edmund's method of removing the devil from someone was to carry out a massive beating. One member, Burgess Starr, began having doubts about whether or not Edmund was really an apostle. In true cult leader fashion, Edmund countered these doubts by announcing that God told him that Burgess was insincere in his faith and should be shunned. As a matter of fact, all the men in the church, besides Edmund and 3 other men, were insincere and should be shunned. So the remaining members, all women plus 3 men, did. Even women who were married to those men shunned them. At the end of the summer, the church needed to find a place to go since they were still banned from operating within the Corvallis city limits. Maud and her mother, Sarah Hurt, answered their prayer by offering the entire church, about 20 people, a place to stay on their property just outside the city limits. Sarah's husband, O.V. Hurt, was not interested in the church at first. He somehow existed at his own house as an outsider. He was just happy to have his wife back at home instead of out on the island. Edmund finally wore O.V. down, though, and he quit his job and joined the church. After that, the house became solely about the church. The followers took furniture and belongings outside and lit them on fire, supposedly to make more room for church members and sermons. This encouraged rumors that a baby was sacrificed in one of the bonfires. When a sheriff arrived at the house to follow up on the claim, he saw that the baby in question was alive and well. He did talk to Edmund about burning a dog and a cat carcass in the fire, but that wasn't illegal, and the church members assured him that it had nothing to do with their religion. The only option the sheriff had left was to take both Edmund and his right-hand man, Charles Brooks, into custody and have them examined by a psychiatrist. Though the locals were hoping that the self-proclaimed prophet would be found a danger to himself and others and be locked up in a mental hospital, psychiatrists found him and Charles to be sound enough to remain free. The residents of Corvallis were at their wits' end with the Holy Rollers turning their town into a laughingstock. On August 30th, 1903, a group of young men arrived at the Hurt residence while Edmund was conducting a sermon. They pounded on the door, but they were ignored. The group began throwing rocks at the house, breaking windows, but the sermon continued. Finally, the group knocked over the outhouses and left. Edmund told his congregation that the end of the world was in sight and they needed to prepare for glory. The following day, Edmund and Charles fled the house, but after a few days, Ovie and Sarah's son, Frank Hurt, brought them back. They needed God's elect to instruct them on what to do next. They began expanding the Hurt residence to make it a grand tabernacle where Edmund could preach. Around this time, Ovie accepted an invitation from James Barrie to go to Portland. After a few days out of the influence of Edmund, Ovie returned to his normal self and began realizing that he didn't want to have anything to do with the Holy Rollers. When he returned from Portland, he told Edmund that he was no longer welcome in his home, and to his surprise, Edmund and Charles packed up and left without incident. The rest of the Hurt family were still devoted to God's elect, and Frank tried to move with Edmund to the coast, but after an accident with their buggy, they returned to an area just outside of Corvallis city limits, and Frank purchased another house for them to live in. Once settled in, Edmund announced that he would be marrying 16-year-old Esther Mitchell, one of the followers. Esther's older sister, Phoebe, was not about to let that happen, so she had her younger sister committed to the Boys and Girls Aid Society in Portland. When Esther told the doctors that Edmund was not just God's elect, but actually God, they deemed her deranged, a more acceptable term at the time. At the new house, Edmund announced to the congregation that God had spoken to him and told him that one of the women in the church would give birth to the second Jesus. Every woman there was eligible to become the new Virgin Mary. Even women who had children, being rebaptized by Edmund, were now virgins again. God told Edmund that he would be the new Joseph, but that he wanted Edmund to take a more active role in the making of the new Jesus. So, of course, he needed to start sleeping with every woman who was a member of the church. This is when they were officially deemed the brides of Christ. Over the Christmas season in 1903, the house that was owned by Frank Hurt became the setting of group sex between members of the church, mothers and daughters, young and old. On January 4th, 1904, a group of 20 men from Corvallis banded together, calling themselves the Whitecaps. They took a ferry across the river to the property where the Holy Rollers were living. Men surrounded the house, and a few broke down the door where they found Edmund, Charles, and 2 other men surrounded by barefoot women. They tied up the men and took them back across the river to Corvallis. In town, they ordered Edmund and Charles to undress before coating them in pine tar. Then they covered them both with feathers. The other 2 men got pine tar and feathers just on the top of their heads. Edmund and Charles were told to put their clothes back on and threatened to never return to their town. Frank Hurt was in Corvallis that night and helped the men get back to the house and clean the pine tar from their bodies. The Holy Roller activity died down in the Corvallis area, and people there thought they had seen the last of the church, but they had only moved to Portland for the time being. An important but largely overlooked detail was that Edmund had married Maud Hurt at the Albany courthouse on January 5th, the day after he was tarred and feathered. Edmund quickly disappeared from the area, and Maud moved back with her parents. This would be completely unimportant outside of the fact that adultery was illegal at the time in the state of Oregon, and Burgess Starr had filed a complaint with the district attorney's office claiming that Edmund had a relationship with his wife, Donna Starr. Donna was actually Maud's aunt because Maud's mom, Sarah Hurt, was Burgess Starr's sister. Donna had left the church, not willingly, when Burgess moved them to Portland. Once Edmund started living in Portland, they began having a relationship. Once the news that Burgess had filed a complaint against Edmund got around, 12 other men went to the district attorney wanting to file charges for the same thing. The DA couldn't just arrest Edmund based on the assumption of 13 men, but when Burgess brought Donna down to the police station, she had no problem signing an affidavit admitting that she had improper relations with Edmund. The DA issued a warrant before the ink on the affidavit was even dry. The only problem now was that the prophet had disappeared. After Edmund fled, his followers didn't stop their church activities. They would spend all day lying face down on the ground, praying to the Lord for further light. They began interpreting the Bible literally, believing that they were not to eat cooked food or go to work. They would fast for days on end and began looking malnutritioned. One thing that got a lot of attention at the time was that the followers went outside bareheaded. It was a time when everyone covered their head when they went outside, and the fact that they walked around bareheaded was a sure sign of insanity. Since authorities couldn't locate Edmund, they needed to do something else to put an end to the Holy Roller cult. One by one, the members of the Brides of Christ Church were committed. The minors were sent to the Boys and Girls Aid Society in Portland. The adults were sent to the Oregon State Insane Asylum, which is still in operation today and has been renamed the Oregon State Hospital. The last member of the church to be committed was Sarah Hurt. She claimed that she wasn't related to her husband and that God was her husband. When the sheriff arrived on June 27th, Sarah put up a fight and ripped off all of her clothes. As she was dragged from the house, mostly nude, she screamed at her husband, "I hate you, but I love Edmund." On July 29th, Edmund was located. He was actually living under Ovi's house. He was pale, emaciated, nude, and his hair was sticking out wildly, matted with dirt. He was taken to jail and spent a little time recovering before being taken to court and tried for adultery. Edmund pleaded not guilty and told the court that he did not want a lawyer. He believed that God would plead his case for him. He told the judge, "If God desires to have me found guilty, I shall receive it joyfully." Edmund Creffield was found guilty of adultery and sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary. After 17 months, on December 13, 1905, he was released from prison and it clearly had not changed him. Edmund was now claiming to be the risen Jesus Christ. By the time Edmund was released from prison, the rest of his flock had been released from the various institutions for which they had been confined. Edmund reconnected with his wife Maud, Frank, and Sarah. He told them that he was going to create a new Eden on the Oregon coast, and that would be a safe haven, which they would need because he had called down the wrath of an angry God on the cities of Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and of course, Corvallis. When a 7.9 earthquake destroyed San Francisco on April 18, 1906, Edmund's followers were that much more convinced that he was communicating with God. People in the city of Newport, Oregon began noticing an influx of women walking south through their community to the area that Edmund had declared the New Eden. Two of those women were Cora and Sophie Hartley. Cora was the wife of a wealthy mine owner, Lewis Hartley, and Sophie was his daughter. Sophie was only days away from graduating college, but Edmund told her to forget college because all learning was the work of the devil. So just know, if you're learning anything from this video, you can thank the devil. Lewis was not about to lose his wife and daughter to a notorious lunatic, so he followed the women to the coast. He bought a gun and waited by the ferry that would take Edmund and his flock across the Yaquina Bay to the Yahats River. When Edmund arrived, Lewis approached the preacher and, with the gun inches from his head, he pulled the trigger. Click. He pulled the trigger again. Click. Then again and again. Click, click. It turned out that the gun Lewis had purchased used centerfire ammo, but Lewis had loaded it with rimfire ammo. This led the Brides of Christ to believe that Edmund was impossible to kill. The group stayed at their New Eden location for a little while, but Edmund eventually fled north to escape multiple people who were gunning for him. One of those people was George Mitchell, Esther's brother. He had received word that Maud had purchased a train ticket to Seattle, so he traveled north to look for her husband. He asked some other people who knew Edmund if they had seen him, but they hadn't, so George walked around Seattle for 5 days. Finally, he spotted Edmund and Maud walking down First Avenue on their way to do some shopping. George waited in the shadows for the couple to pass, and when they did, he put a revolver to the back of Edmund's head and pulled the trigger. Edmund Creffield fell to the ground dead. George was arrested and charged with murder. The defense brought a number of witnesses to the stand who testified that George was told about the group sex amongst the church members, which included his own mother and sisters. Then he was told that Edmund had announced that Esther was to be the new Virgin Mary, and he snapped. George Mitchell was found not guilty by reason of insanity and released. While Maud was mourning the death of her husband, fully expecting him to rise from the dead and smite his enemies, the rest of the Brides of Christ were still camping on the Oregon coast, expecting him to return. They were unaware that their leader had been brought to vigilante justice in the streets of Seattle. A few days after George's acquittal, he and his father were planning to return to Portland. They tried to talk Esther into going with them, but she refused. She planned on staying with Maud in Seattle, her devotion to the late Edmund Crefeld unwavering. This is why it came as a shock when George saw Esther at the train station waiting to tell him goodbye. As the station master announced the departure, Esther pulled a revolver from under her coat and shot George in the head, killing him. Esther was arrested for murder and Maud was arrested for being involved in the plan. While awaiting trial, Maud seemed to come out of the spell she had been under and began doubting the teachings of Edmund. The jail staff said she gradually became more lively and started expressing emotion. That emotion must have taken over, and before the trial began, Maud took her own life by poisoning herself with strychnine. Eventually, Esther was declared insane and sent to the Western Washington Hospital for the Insane, now called the Western State Hospital. Esther was released from the hospital in 1909 and committed suicide in 1914 by strychnine poisoning. In time, the remaining Brides of Christ dispersed from their camp on the Oregon coast and moved to various coastal towns. Most of them returned to somewhat normal lives, whatever that may be. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.